Welcome to the end of chapter 10. So we only have a few slides left, and actually we're going to get right into chapter 11. Chapter 11 is all of the muscles of the muscular system, and I have made a lab packet for you with all the human muscles in it that I want you to know. So I have shortened chapter 11 a lot because I've made that lab packet, which is covering the majority of chapter 11. So there's only a few slides in chapter 11 that I'm actually going to go over with you, okay? So the first part of this last section of chapter 10 is talking about cardiac muscle, and then we'll talk about smooth muscle. So the majority of chapter 10 was all about skeletal muscle, because the muscular system is the skeletal muscle that we're talking about. But I do like to mention these last two muscle types because they are muscles of the body. Cardiac muscle is really important. It's found only in the heart, and it is a single or binucleated structure. It is branched. It does have the striation, so we still have that actin and myosin lines. But what it doesn't have as intense of a sarcoplasmic reticulum. And because of that, cardiac muscle has to have calcium channels in it in the plasma membrane to allow calcium to move in that way as well. So cardiac muscle has a sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it also has calcium channels external that allow for extra calcium to move in. This typically means cardiac muscle is going to beat a little bit slower than skeletal muscle beat. That sounds wrong. To contract a little bit slower than skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle also does not need any innervation by the nervous system. So the nervous system does innervate cardiac muscle, but it doesn't need that innervation. So cardiac muscle contracts on its own. It has pacemaker cells. The actual pacemaker cells that are in cardiac muscle, the major one is called the sinoatrial node. It's found in the right atrium. And it will send a signal about every 0.8 seconds, depending on what we need. So what the nervous system does is it will stimulate our muscles to either, our cardiac muscle to either speed up or slow down. Also within cardiac muscle, we have these intercalated discs. Intercalated discs contain both desmosomes and gap junctions. Desmosomes hold cells together, whereas gap junctions allow for communication between one and another cell. So we can send that stimulus from the SA node down to the muscle fibers in the ventricles. So the ventricles will also contract. Smooth muscle, then, so we'll study the cardiac system when we get into the cardiovascular system. We'll study cardiac muscle even further then. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, we don't really have a specific system for smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is found throughout all of our organ systems. We have smooth muscle that we talked about, we could talk, or I'm not sure if I talked a lot about it, but we have smooth muscle in the integumentary system that stimulates the hairs on our skin to stand up. They're called erector pili muscles. We have smooth muscle in the digestive system wrapping around all of our organs, allowing for movement of materials. We have smooth muscle in the cardiovascular system surrounding our blood vessels. Smooth muscle is found in the reproductive system, in the urinary system. So smooth muscle is found in a lot of our organ systems. So we talk about smooth muscle all the time. Smooth muscle is a very special type of muscle because it is the only muscle that can undergo replication or reproduction. Smooth muscle cells, when they get damaged, can reproduce themselves, so they can undergo mitosis easily. They are singly nucleated. There we go. They have a fusiform shape, so kind of like the cat's eye. And the nucleus also has that same fusiform shape. I'm going to go back to this slide so you can see that fusiform shape with the nucleus as well. The nucleus is centrally located. They are always singly nucleated. They're very small, and they do not have striations. They do have actin and myosin, but the actin and myosin are arranged differently. So they're connected to structures called dense bodies, and there's dense bodies throughout the cell. And so actin and myosin are kind of connected in different mechanisms, which allows for a contraction that is more of a like spongy contraction, like when you squeeze a sponge and the entire structure shortens and gets smaller. And then when you release it, the entire structure relaxes and goes back to its original shape. That's kind of how smooth muscle works. You have a contraction on all levels or on all planes. The muscle contraction is much slower, and the reason for this is smooth muscle has no sarcoplasmic reticulum, so all of the calcium has to move in from the extracellular region. And there's no troponin, so we don't have that regulation by the troponin. Instead, we regulate smooth muscle by calmodulin. So calmodulin will bind to calcium when calcium comes in from the extracellular region, and calmodulin then will activate myosin light chain kinase. And myosin light chain kinase is what activates the myosin head or phosphorylates the ATP, allowing the ATP to then, or allowing the myosin head to then attach to the actin. So smooth muscle contracts and relaxes much slower than both cardiac and skeletal muscle. This is just a comparison of the three muscle types. I always like to put something like this so you guys kind of see they have similarities, but they are all very different as well. All right. So we finished chapter 10. And I was looking at answers of the critical thinking questions, and here are some of the critical thinking questions that I thought were really good. And so I've put them on here. Doesn't mean that other ones aren't good, but these are really good critical thinking questions that you might find on your next exam. Also, you always want to go over the multiple choice questions, because I always add 1 or 2 or sometimes 3, maybe even 4 multiple choice questions to your exam from the chapters. And hey, guess what? Since we're only at 8 minutes, I'm going to finish this up in chapter 11. So welcome to chapter 11, the muscular system again. But in this chapter, we're only going to go over a few of those slides. So I am just floored by this picture. This is the weirdest picture ever. So this is a person practicing yoga. I don't understand. So when I think of yoga, I think of, okay, you're in a meditation state, but why would you tie your body up? That just, I don't understand that. It's more like he's trying to turn into a pretzel, but that's just, to me, weird. It's amazing that people can do this. I'm just, when I look at this picture, I don't understand. But what this picture does show is how flexible our body is due to the voluntary use of our muscles. So when we look at our muscles, which we learned about in the last chapter, muscles are attached to our bones, and typically muscles are attached to 2 different bones. So we have a region of the muscle that is attached by a tendon to a bone that is immovable, and that is called the origin. And then we have another region of the muscle that is attached to a bone that is movable, and that is the insertion. So the biceps brachii is a muscle that is attached to the scapula and to the radius. The biceps brachii originates on the scapula, inserts on the radius, and the movable bone, the radius, moves up towards the humerus. So origin is the immovable region, insertion is the movable bone. Biceps brachii moves the radius towards the humerus. So it's the insertion. Make sense? The agonist of a muscle, also known as the prime mover of a muscle. I like the word prime mover easier because I think it makes the other terms easier to understand and to remember. The prime mover of a muscle or agonist is the muscle that produces an action. An example, the biceps brachii, it is the prime mover of forearm flexion. A synergist then aids the prime mover. The brachialist is a synergist to the biceps brachii, which means the brachialist also functions in forearm flexion. An antagonist, and this is why I like the word prime mover and not agonist, because the antagonist is the muscle that produces the opposite action. So the antagonist of forearm flexion is forearm extension, and that is our triceps brachii. So if we use the term agonist for muscle, the prime mover of a muscle action, then that would get very confusing when we say the antagonist produces the opposite action. And so you can use either term, but I typically use prime mover just to keep you from confusing agonist and antagonist, okay? One of the last things we're going to talk about in this chapter, I told you this is going to be real short and simple because you do have that large, the very thick lab that I handed you out already. Hopefully, unless you didn't get it, then I'll hand it out soon. Is how we name muscles. So we can name muscles multiple ways. We can name them according to their action. So a muscle action is like flexion or extension. Examples, we have flexor digitorum is a flexor muscle of the digits. It causes our digits to flex. Pronator muscle causes our arms, our hands to pronate or to turn prone. Extensor digitorum causes our fingers, our digits, to extend. So those are examples of muscles named for their action. Specific body regions, so muscles that are at a specific region of the body and named for that body region. Example, temporalis. It's found on the temporal bone. It originates on the temporal bone and it inserts on the mandible. So it's named for the body region. Tibialis anterior is on the anterior of the tibia. That's another one. Muscle attachment. So where is a muscle attached to? This could be the origins and insertions of a muscle, and so there's a lot of different areas that muscles are attached to. So my favorite example is sternocleidomastoid. This is a long name, but the name tells you the origins and the insertion. So the sternocleidomastoid originates on the sternum and the clavicle, sternocleido, and then it inserts on the mastoid process. And so since the insertion is the mastoid process, its function is to allow your head to roll from side to side. We can name muscle according to the orientation of muscle fibers. So I always like to talk about the obliques because that's like my favorite. So oblique means an angle. We have already talked about an oblique plane, so you know that angle. The term rectus means lengthwise. So if you look at like the rectus abdominis, it runs the length of the abdominal region. Rectus femoris, the length of the femoral region. But your obliques run at an angle. We have internal and external oblique muscles that run either at an angle towards the pubis or towards the xiphoid process. And then muscle shape. So what does the muscle look like? Deltoid is triangular shaped. Trapezius is trapezoidal shape. Orbicularis is circular, which I did not know that word meant circular, but that's what it means. So you can look at that. You can also use shape like short muscles. We have adductor longus, adductor brevis. Those are both adductor muscles, but they are also named for their shape because they are short or long muscles. The size of a muscle. So maximus is a big muscle, whereas minimus is a small muscle. Gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, those are all named for the size of the muscle. And then the number of heads or origins that a muscle has. Biceps has 2 origins. Triceps has 3 origins. So those are examples of the number of origins that a muscle has. This is just a figure from your textbook that shows multiple muscles, anterior and posterior view of the muscles, but you have your lab, or you will have your lab if you don't have it yet, that will show all the muscles that I expect you to know. So there are, hundreds, like there's over 700 skeletal muscles, but you only have to know about 60 or 65 of these muscles. You have to know the origin, the insertion, and the function, but you only have to know one origin, one insertion, and one function for each muscle. So don't overly stress. And last but not least, I also looked at the questions in the back of this chapter. You want to go over the multiple choice questions, but also look at questions 30 and 31, as well as 37 through 40 under critical thinking, because those are things that I think are good questions that I could potentially use on your exam. So you have a wonderful day. I will post these and get them. So I'll post this so that you have it, and I'll get your study guide and homework posted as well. Bye.